She was a powerful judge's property, but a dying town called her their savior. The air in the fever-soaked tent was a claustrophobic mix of desperation, fragile resilience, and suffocating dread. Fever Gulch was a town fixin' to die, and Nora Jennings was the only person standing in the way. She moved with the nurse's calm precision, wiping a sick child's brow with a cool cloth. Her hands were steady, her voice a low murmur of comfort, a quiet display of unbreakable will in the face of utter chaos. Every life she saved was a small victory, her medical knowledge the only ace in the hole she possessed against the sickness. But with every breath she drew, she felt the phantom grip of Judge Sterling Hawthorne. She had escaped his gilded cage, but the fear of being owned again was a disease worse than any fever. That's when she saw him through the tent flap, a lone rider, tall and still in the saddle, his gaze sweeping over the dying town. He wasn't a miner. He wasn't a doctor. He was something else. The hunter sent to drag her back to hell had finally arrived. Fever Gulch was a town holding its own wake. The air, thin and sharp with the scent of pine and cold rock, was tainted by something else, the sweet, cloying smell of sickness and the acrid bite of carbolic acid. A grim quiet had settled over the single dusty street, a silence punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic coughing that echoed from the shuttered cabins. Hope, it seemed, had already been lowered into the ground. Inside the makeshift infirmary, what had once been the town's meeting hall, Nora Jennings moved through the gloom like a phantom of mercy. She was a woman sculpted by exhaustion, her fine Eastern features now sharpened by hardship, her hands once destined for embroidery now chapped and stained with herbal remedies. She ignored the ache in her back, the burning in her eyes. She moved from cot to cot, a vessel of calm in a sea of suffering. A man, a broad-shouldered miner whose strength had been leached away by the fever, grabbed her wrist with a hand that trembled like a leaf. "Is she—" He rasped, his eyes wild with fear, gesturing to the small child sleeping fitfully beside him. "Her fever broke an hour ago." Nora said, her voice low and steady, a balm against his terror. She gently placed a cool, damp cloth on the girl's forehead. "She is fighting. Now you need to do the same. Drink this." She held a tin cup of bitter willow bark tea to his lips. He drank, his gaze fixed on her, a look of desperate, absolute trust. It was a look she saw on every face in this dying town. A look that terrified her more than the sickness itself. Trust made you visible. Trust got you noticed. As she turned away, the memory came sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass under the skin. It was triggered by the rough lace on a dying woman's collar, a cheap imitation of the fine Brussels lace that had adorned her own gowns. Gowns she wore in the suffocatingly elegant rooms of Judge Sterling Hawthorne's Boston home. She could almost feel the weight of his hand on her shoulder, his voice a proprietary whisper in her ear. "You are a reflection of my station, Eleonora, a beautiful, perfect thing that belongs to me." She flinched, the tin cup rattling against the crate she used as a table. The illusion shattered, leaving her back in the grim reality of Fever Gulch. She was not Eleonora the ornament. She was Nora the runaway, a possession that had slipped its leash. A sudden commotion at the door dragged her from the past. A woman stumbled in her face, a mask of panic. "It's my boy, it's Thomas," she cried, her voice tearing. "He can't breathe. His throat it's closing up." Nora was at her side in an instant. The boy, no older than 8, was in his mother's arms, his small body rigid, his face turning a terrifying shade of dusky blue. He wasn't just coughing, he was suffocating. A thick gray membrane was visibly closing over his windpipe. Diphtheria. The most aggressive form she had ever seen. The town's so-called healer had treated it with smoked sage and useless prayers. Nora knew what had to be done. It was a risky, desperate procedure she had only read about in medical journals, a procedure that required a surgeon's nerve and a steady hand. An emergency tracheotomy. To perform it would be to announce that she was far more than a simple country nurse with a knowledge of herbs. It would be a beacon in the dark, one that could be seen for miles. One that could be seen by the kind of man who hunted for a living. The boy let out a final strangled gasp, his eyes rolling back. There was no more time. The choice was gone. She was a healer first, a fugitive second. Nora turned to the stunned onlookers, her voice ringing with an authority she thought she had buried forever. "Get me a bottle of whiskey, the sharpest knife you have, and a clean straw from the livery," she commanded, her eyes blazing with a cold, brilliant fire. "And boil water. Now, clear this space. The rest of you out." The world narrowed to the space on the cleared table, illuminated by the stark, unforgiving light of 3 oil lamps. The chaotic fear of the room receded, muted by a wall of pure cold focus that rose within Eleonora Nora Jennings. This was her domain. The part of her that was Judge Hawthorne's elegant possession, the part that was a terrified runaway, both dissolved, burned away by the white-hot clarity of purpose. All that remained was the nurse. Her hands, which had trembled moments before with the memory of his phantom touch, were now impossibly steady. "Hold his head. Do not move," she commanded the boy's mother, her voice devoid of any emotion but resolve. The woman, her face a mess of tears and grime, did as she was told, her knuckles white as she cradled her son. Nora cleansed the small patch of skin on the boy's throat with raw whiskey, the sting of it sharp in the air. She took the knife, its blade glittering. It was a crude tool for so delicate a task. She pressed its tip against the softest skin just below the Adam's apple at the small hollow space she had located with her finger. She did not hesitate. A single precise incision. A wellspring of dark blood. A gasp from the onlookers. Nora ignored them. She worked quickly, her mind a silent catalog of anatomical charts studied years ago in a Boston library. She parted the tissue, her fingers deft and sure. She found the windpipe, its pale ribbed cartilage shockingly white against the blood. Another cut this one small, controlled through the membrane between 2 rings of cartilage. There was a horrifying wet sucking sound. Then silence. The boy was no longer fighting for air. He was not breathing at all. For one heart-stopping second, Nora thought she had failed. The ghost of her past failure rose, its cold fingers closing around her throat. "You've killed him," it whispered. The straw, she snapped her own voice, chasing the ghost away. A trembling hand passed her a clean, hollow reed. She inserted it carefully into the incision, a makeshift cannula to bypass the suffocating membrane that had sealed his throat. She held her breath, her ear close to the opening. And then she heard it. A sound more beautiful than any symphony. A soft, wet, but unmistakable rush of air. The boy's chest rose, a shallow, shuddering movement. Then it fell, and rose again. He was breathing. The blue tint on his lips began to recede, chased away by the slow, miraculous return of life. A collective sigh of awe and relief swept through the room. The boy's mother collapsed into quiet, grateful sobs. Nora stood up, her entire body trembling with the release of a tension so profound it had held her rigid. She had done it. She had pulled a life back from the brink. The townsfolk were staring at her with a new expression, reverence. It was the look of people who had just witnessed a miracle. And that look was the most dangerous thing in the world. As she began to clean the knife, her hands finally shaking, a new shadow fell across the open doorway, blocking the fading light. A man stood there, tall and still. He was not a miner. His clothes were worn but practical, built for the trail, not the tunnels. He wore his gun low on his hip, tied down, the mark of a professional. His face was lean, weathered, and his eyes missed nothing. They swept over the scene, the cots, the sick, the relieved mother, and finally they landed on Nora. It was not the look of awe she had just seen on the others. It was the calm, patient, assessing gaze of a hunter who had just located his quarry. "Heard there was trouble," the man said. His voice was calm, a low baritone that seemed out of place in the room of ragged breathing. Nora felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine, chilling the warmth of her recent victory. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "The trouble is passing," she replied, her own voice tight. "What do you want here?" He gave a slow, easy shrug, his gaze never leaving hers. "My horse threw a shoe. Blacksmith in this town any good? He's over there," Nora said, nodding toward one of the cots. "With the fever." "My luck," the stranger said without a hint of disappointment. He touched the brim of his hat. "Name's Ryder. Gideon Ryder. I'll be at the saloon should he recover." He was lying. She knew it with a certainty that was bone deep. Every easy movement, every calm word was a falsehood, a carefully constructed front. He wasn't a traveler. He was a purpose, and she knew with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity that his purpose was her. Judge Hawthorne had a long reach. Ryder turned to leave, and Nora was forced to turn her own back on him, her attention needed by the boy on the table. The child's life was still fragile. She couldn't afford to be distracted. But as she checked the boy's pulse, a weak but steady flutter beneath her fingertips, she watched Ryder's silhouette move down the dusty street. The boy behind her was breathing a life she had just saved. But the man walking away was a promise of death, the end of the life she had fought so desperately to build. The fever was a beast she could fight with knowledge and skill. This man, this hunter, was a different kind of sickness, and she had no idea how to cure it. The night did not bring rest. It brought a deeper, more intimate kind of fear. With the boy, Thomas, breathing steadily through the makeshift reed in his throat, the crisis of the moment had passed only to be replaced by the suffocating presence of the man named Gideon Ryder. The infirmary, once Nora's sanctuary of purpose, now felt like a cage brightly lit for the hunter's convenience. Every scrape of a boot outside, every shift in the wind, sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. She moved through the long hours of the night, a ghost tending to other ghosts. She changed sweat-soaked linens, spooned weak broth into parted lips, and listened to the ragged symphony of a town fighting for its life. But her senses were tuned to a different frequency. She was listening for a single set of footsteps, watching for a particular shadow to fall across the doorway again. He did not come. But when the sun rose, casting a pale, sickly light over the dust of Fever Gulch, she saw him. He was leaning against a hitching post across the street, a pillar of unsettling stillness in the morning chill. He was ostensibly watching the livery, but Nora felt his gaze on the infirmary door as if it were a physical touch. He was not impatient. He was not aggressive. He was simply waiting. It was the patience of a wolf outside a sheepfold, a predator who understood that time and attrition were his greatest weapons. A woman, the blacksmith's wife, entered the hall, her eyes red-rimmed but filled with a light of awe that made Nora deeply uneasy. She carried a small bowl of watery stew. "He's awake," the woman whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Our Thomas, he's asking for water. He's—" She couldn't finish, simply pressing the warm bowl into Nora's hands. "God bless you, miss. We had no one. No one ever fought for us like this." The simple, heartfelt words were a comfort and a curse. Each expression of gratitude was another brick in the wall that was forming around her, a wall built of the town's desperate love. But it was also a spotlight making her brighter, clearer, an easier target for the man across the street. The woman's gratitude threw her back into the gilded cage of her memory. Judge Sterling Hawthorne had praised her too. He had admired her skill at hosting his political dinners, her flawless management of his household staff, her quiet elegance on his arm. "Such a capable woman you are, Eleonora," he'd once said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a gesture that was both a caress and a claim. "A perfect asset. You elevate everything you touch. He had never seen her. He had only ever seen a beautiful, skilled object that belonged to him. The blacksmith's wife saw a savior. The judge had seen a possession. Nora wasn't sure which was more dangerous. Later that afternoon, the hunter moved. He approached the infirmary not with a lawman's stride, but with the casual gait of a concerned traveler. He carried a bucket of water from the main well, the one farthest from the sick. "Figured you could use this," Ryder said, his voice as calm and level as it had been the night before. He set the bucket down near the door. "Clean water is hard to come by in a place like this." Nora stood blocking his entry, her posture stiff. "We are managing." His eyes moved past her, taking in the rows of cots, the weary faces, the quiet order she had carved from the chaos. It was not a glance. It was an inventory. He was cataloging her work, her methods, her impact. "Seems you're the only thing holding this town together," he observed, his gaze returning to her. It was sharp, analytical, and deeply unsettling. "A woman with your skills. It's a rare thing to find in a place like Fever Gulch." The question was there, hanging in the air between them, unspoken but deadly. What is a woman like you doing in a place like this? It was a key, turning in a lock. Nora felt the blood drain from her face, but she held his gaze, her own expression, a carefully constructed mask of professional detachment. "A fever doesn't care where it finds you, Mr. Ryder," she said, her voice cool. "And a nurse's duty is the same everywhere." She deflected the question, turning the personal into the universal. For a long moment he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes then. It wasn't pity. It wasn't admiration. It looked like conflict. He had come to this town to apprehend a fugitive, a simple task for a man of his talents. He had found instead a saint presiding over her own desperate flock. He had come to retrieve a piece of property and had found the town's beating heart. This realization didn't make him seem less dangerous. It made him seem more so. A predictable predator was one thing. A man wrestling with his own conscience was another thing entirely. He finally gave a slow nod, as if acknowledging a move in a silent game of chess. "The blacksmith's wife says he'll be on his feet in a day or two," he said. "Strong man." He touched the brim of his hat again. "I'll wait for him to fix my horse's shoe. Then I'll be on my way." It was a simple statement of logistics. But to Nora, it sounded like a deadline. A clock had just started ticking. The cat-and-mouse game was over. He had given her a day, 2 at most. Then the hunter would claim his prize. A full day passed, a fragile truce held in the space between the infirmary and the saloon. The blacksmith, a man of iron and muscle, was now sitting up, taking broth from his wife's trembling hand, a living testament to Nora's skill. The boy Thomas was sleeping, his small chest rising and falling with a deep, even rhythm that was the most beautiful sound Nora had ever heard. The fever in the town was not broken, but it had been fought to a standstill. Hope, thin and watery but real, had begun to seep back into the cracks of Fever Gulch. But for Nora, hope was a foreign country she was no longer allowed to visit. With every life she saved, she felt the invisible net drawing tighter. The awe in the townspeople's eyes was a cage, their gratitude the bars. And Gideon Ryder watched it all. He was a part of the landscape now, a fixed point of dread. He no longer pretended to be waiting for the blacksmith. He was waiting for her. The deadline he had set with his parting words echoed in her mind with every beat of her tired heart. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, she stepped outside the infirmary for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The air was cool on her feverish skin. She needed a moment away from the smell of sickness and lie a moment to simply breathe. She walked a few paces from the door, her gaze fixed on the distant, unforgiving mountains, and closed her eyes. It's a fine evening for an execution. The voice was low, calm, and directly behind her. She didn't jump. Her body went rigid, a cold, terrible stillness seizing her. She had known this moment was coming, had rehearsed it in 1,000 panicked nightmares. She opened her eyes and turned slowly. Gideon Ryder stood there no more than 10 feet away. The fading light carved his face into sharp planes and hard shadows. The pretense of the passing traveler was gone, stripped away to reveal the cold, efficient purpose beneath. "Your time is up, Eleonora," he said. The use of her full name was a key turning in a lock, the final slam of a cell door she had been running from for years. There was no escape. There was no more hiding. The hunter had named his prey. "How did you find me?" She whispered the words barely audible. "It's my trade," he replied, his voice devoid of pride or malice. It was a simple statement of fact. Judge Sterling Hawthorne is a man of considerable influence, and he wants his property returned. The word property struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was the summation of her entire existence in the judge's world, a thing to be owned, displayed, and retrieved if it dared to wander. "I am not his property," she said, her voice shaking but laced with a sudden sharp anger. "I am a person." "That's a matter for you and him to discuss," Ryder said, unmoved. "My concern is the contract. You come with me now peacefully." A raw, desperate courage surged through her. "No." She saw a flicker of surprise in his otherwise impassive eyes. He had expected tears, pleading. He had not expected defiance. "Look around you, Mr. Ryder," she said, her voice gaining strength, gesturing toward the infirmary. "This town is dying. The blacksmith you were waiting for, he would be dead. That boy Thomas, he would be dead. They will all die if I leave. I am the only thing standing between this entire town and a mass grave." She took a step closer, her fear burning away into a righteous fury. "You see sick people. I see a dozen families. You see a contract. I see lives. Is your silver worth that much? Is the judge's gold worth the ghosts of all these people?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting from her face to the light burning in the infirmary window. She saw it again, the conflict churning behind his stoic mask. He was a man with a job to do, a simple, brutal line to walk. But she had dragged him off that line into a moral swamp, and he was sinking. "My job is not to care," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Just as he spoke, the bell from the town's tiny makeshift church began to toll a frantic, desperate clang, clang, clang that was not a call to prayer, but a cry of alarm. A man burst from the door of the infirmary, his face ashen with panic. "Nora, it's Martha. The blacksmith's wife. She's collapsed. It's the fever, it's taken her something fierce." The world snapped into sharp, terrible focus. The plague did not wait for moral debates. It did not care about hunters or fugitives. It simply killed. Nora looked at Ryder, her mind racing. This was the moment. Her last desperate gambit. She was no longer a pleading victim. She was a commander on a battlefield, and he was the only soldier she could recruit. "You want me?" she said, her voice ringing with a new and startling authority. "Then you will have me. But on my terms." Ryder's eyes narrowed. "Take me now." She challenged, her chin high, her gaze unflinching. "Drag me away. But you will do it, knowing you have just condemned that woman to death. Her husband, who is still too weak to stand, will watch her die because of you. Her children will be orphans because of you. The judge's money will be stained with the blood of this whole family. Is that a price you are willing to pay, Mr. Ryder?" The man from the infirmary was screaming her name again. "Or," Nora pressed on, her voice dropping to a low, intense command, "you can help me. You can be my gun. You can be my guard. This town is on the edge of panic. They need a strong hand to keep order while I do my work. You can protect me not from the law, but for these people, you can help me save this town." She held out her hands, not in surrender, but as if showing him the tools of her trade. "And I give you my word. On the soul, I have left. When the fever breaks, when the last patient is safe, I will walk out of this town with you. I will not run. I will not fight. The contract will be fulfilled." He stared at her, caught in the crossfire of his duty and his conscience. The panicked tolling of the church bell was a hammer beating against the iron will of his profession. He was a hunter, and she was his prey. But she had just offered him the chance to be something else entirely. A protector, a partner, a man who chose a side. And in the long, agonizing silence as the cries for her grew more desperate, Nora waited to see which man would win. The world, tilted on its axis, reset by a choice made in the space between two heartbeats. Gideon Ryder did not offer words of comfort or concession. He simply gave a single curt nod, the decision made. A flicker of his eyes toward the infirmary was all the command he needed to give himself. "Get to it, then, nurse," he said, his voice flat, already detaching from the man he had been a moment ago. He turned not toward Nora, but toward the chaos, his hand resting not on his gun, but on the arm of the panicked man who had summoned her. "She needs space to work. Get back inside and help." And just like that, the hunter became the shepherd's dog. The days that followed blurred into a grueling, surreal rhythm of life and death, of shared unspoken purpose. Nora worked until her bones ached and her vision swam, fueled by bitter coffee and a will that refused to break. She moved through the rows of cots, a general on a desperate battlefield, fighting the fever with every tool she possessed, her knowledge, her hands, her voice. She was no longer just a fugitive. She was the beating heart of Fever Gulch's survival. And Gideon Ryder was the wall that protected that heart. He was a force of quiet, implacable order. He stood guard at the infirmary door for hours on end, a silent sentinel who drank his coffee black and missed nothing. His presence alone was enough to quell the rising panic that threatened to consume the town. When a desperate miner tried to force his way in, convinced a stolen bottle of laudanum was the cure, Ryder didn't draw his gun. He simply stepped into the man's path, a figure of such unyielding authority that the miner faltered, mumbled an apology, and retreated. He organized the healthiest commands low and clear. He sent men to hunt, bringing back fresh meat for the broth that Nora insisted was crucial. He enforced the quarantine with an iron will, ensuring the sickness was contained. He was brutally, terrifyingly efficient. He was doing for the town what he had once done in pursuit of a single person, tracking, managing, and controlling the landscape. They rarely spoke not of anything that mattered. Theirs was a communication of necessity, of shared exhaustion. One night, as Nora was about to collapse onto a cot for a few precious hours of sleep, he appeared at her side with a steaming tin cup. "You can't save them if you're dead on your feet," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet hall. "And you can't collect your bounty if I am." She countered, her voice sharp with a weariness that went deeper than her bones. She took the coffee without thanking him. It was not a gift, it was an investment. Another day she tended to a deep gash on his forearm, a wound he'd gotten while chopping firewood for the infirmary's stove. Her touch was clinical, her fingers deftly cleaning and stitching the wound. "You're as good with a needle as you are with a knife," he observed, his gaze fixed on her careful work. "A skill I was taught for more delicate things than mending bounty hunters," she replied, pulling the final stitch tight. She was thinking of the judge, of the endless hours spent on useless, beautiful embroidery to please his guests. Now that same skill was closing the flesh of the man sent to drag her back to that life. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. Through it all, she watched him. The fear she held for him began to change, transmuting into a complex, wary respect. He never spoke of Judge Hawthorne. He never asked about her past. He treated their pact with the solemn professionalism of a contract, postponing his original purpose without question. She started to see the man beneath the reputation, a man of profound competence, of a strange and lonely integrity. The hunter was still there, she knew, coiled and waiting. But she had also seen the protector, and she began to wonder which one was real. Slowly, miraculously, their combined efforts began to turn the tide. The fevers started to break. The terrible rattling coughs softened. Color returned to the cheeks of children who had been on the precipice of death. The grim quiet of the town was gradually replaced by the sounds of recovery, of cautious, fragile hope. The victory was a sunrise in Nora's weary soul, but it was a sunrise that cast a long, dark shadow. The end of the fever meant the end of their truce. One evening, the air was clear and cold for the first time in weeks. The scent of sickness had finally been washed away by a clean mountain wind. Nora and Ryder stood outside the infirmary, two solitary figures in the quiet twilight. The town was sleeping a deep, peaceful sleep. The battle was over. "You did good work here," Eleonora Ryder said quietly, his voice soft. The use of her full name after days of being nurse, or nothing at all, was a stark and brutal reminder. It was the sound of a contract being reinstated, of a debt coming due. The protector was receding and the hunter was re-emerging from the shadows. "You helped," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, then, his face unreadable in the gathering dark. "The blacksmith is on his feet. My horse is shod. The fever has broken." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "We leave at dawn." Dawn broke not with the fiery promise of a new day, but with the cold, gray finality of a sentence being carried out. The air in Fever Gulch was clean now, the scent of pine and damp earth having replaced the sweet stench of sickness. The town was alive, and because of that, Nora had to leave it. She met Gideon Ryder at the edge of town as promised. He had both horses saddled and ready, their breath pluming in the chill. He stood waiting, a figure of quiet resolution. The hunter was back, his temporary role as protector shed with the coming of the light. Nora carried nothing but a small cloth bundle. She had left her medical bag, her books, her remedies. They belonged here now. She had paid for her brief time as the town's savior with the only currency she had left, her word. "I'm ready," she said, her voice clear, devoid of the tremor she felt in her soul. Ryder gave a single somber nod. He held the reins of her horse out to her. It was time. The debt was due. But as she reached to take them, a new figure emerged from the morning mist. The blacksmith, his face grim, his broad shoulders blocking their path. Then his wife appeared at his side, another miner, and another. Within a minute, a silent crowd of a dozen townspeople stood between them and the open trail. They held no weapons. Their presence was the only shield they needed. "You're not taking her, Ryder," the blacksmith said, his voice a low, rumbling threat. Ryder's hand rested on his saddle horn, not his gun. He looked at the wall of determined faces, his own expression unreadable. "This is not your concern," he said, his voice even. "This is a matter of law, a contract. She is our concern." The blacksmith's wife countered, her voice ringing with a strength Nora had never heard from her before. "She's the reason any of us are still here to draw breath. That's a higher law than any piece of paper." Nora stood frozen between them, between the captor she had come to respect and the people she had come to love. For her entire life she had run. She had hidden. She had fought for herself alone. Now for the first time an entire town was standing as her guard. The feeling was so overwhelming, so profoundly moving, it almost brought her to her knees. Gideon Ryder looked at the faces of the people he had helped save. He saw their unwavering loyalty. He looked at Nora, standing not behind them, but with them, her shoulders back, her gaze steady. She was not a frightened fugitive anymore. She was a leader, a healer. He had been sent to retrieve a piece of property, but that property was gone, replaced by this woman of impossible strength. A long silent moment passed. The fate of everyone there hung in the balance of his decision. He could draw his gun. He was fast enough, skilled enough to fight his way out. But he would be fighting his way through the very lives he had, for a few short days, helped to preserve. With a slow, deliberate movement, he took his hand off his saddle horn. He looked at Nora, a final long look that held a universe of unspoken things, regret, respect, and a warning. "He will send others," he said, his voice meant for her alone. Then he swung himself into his own saddle, turned his horse not east toward the law and the judge's gold, but west toward the vast, untamed wilderness. He rode a few paces, then paused, looking back at her one last time over his shoulder. "Good luck, nurse," he said. And then he was gone, a lone rider disappearing into the rising sun, leaving behind a broken contract and a woman he had in the end set free. Nora stood in the dusty street surrounded by her people, and for the first time in her life she felt the sun on her face not as an accuser, but as a promise. She was no longer Eleonora the possession. She was no longer Nora the runaway. She was Nora of Fever Gulch, and she was finally home. If Nora's fight for dignity lit a fire in your chest, if the moment she saved a life with nothing but grit, knowledge, and a stolen name made you hold your breath, then you've just stepped into the heart of the frontier, where justice wears no uniform and healing cuts deeper than any bullet. What stayed with you when she stood firm in the face of the man sent to break her, or when the town finally saw her for what she truly was, smash, that like if Nora's defiance hit home, drop a comment with the line or moment that carved itself into your bones. And next time on Wild West Echo Stories, we follow a mother and daughter stranded on a rooftop, floodwaters rising with only a cynical riverboat captain between them and death. He's lost everything. She's got only her child. And the river doesn't care who's innocent. Subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss this tale of rising waters, broken trust, and the day a man found something worth saving when it was almost too late.